Well, we're about 300 episodes or something in, and I have run out of new ways of saying hello to the Religious Studies Project for this week. I'm David Robertson.
And I'm Christopher Carter.
And this week's interview is Chris's interview, which is why you're hearing my voice at the top of the episode. It's an interview with Atko Remmel on the study of religion and national identity in Estonia. Very timely. We're all thinking about EASR already. So let's pass straight over to Chris.
The Estonian case in the study of religion is something that we've not really talked about very much on the Religious Studies Project, but I am speaking to you right now from the EASR conference in Bern, where I've been hearing quite a bit about it. I've heard some papers, and it was even mentioned quite a bit in one of the keynote lecturers yesterday, and so I thought it would be fantastic to get Atko Remmel, who I've known for a number of years now, onto the RSP to talk about the Estonian context, the study of religion in Estonia, and some of the complex intersections between religion, non-religion, nationalism in this context that's sort of been dominated historically by two foreign religious secular regimes, the German Lutheran Church and Soviet Atheism. So first of all, Atko Remmel, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Religious Studies Project.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. Just to say, Atko is senior researcher in religious studies and also researcher in cultural studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And his work discusses religion, religious indifference, national identity, and more in Estonia, which is said, as I've indicated, to be one of the most secularized countries in Europe. He has a number of publications in this broad area, including one called Religion Interrupted, Observations on Religious Indifference in Estonia, which is in a book in which I and a number of other RSP friends have chapters that's called Religious Indifference, New Perspectives from Studies on Secularization and Non-Religion, edited by Johannes Quack and Cora Schuh. And Atko is also currently the PI on one of the Understanding Unbelief projects. I'm looking at Estonia, but we'll not be talking too much about that just today. So, many of our listeners out there may never have really thought much about the Estonian context at all, so perhaps the way to start would be a broad introduction to Estonia and I guess in relation to religion, potted history, away you go.
Mm-hmm. Well, Estonia is a small country by the Baltic Sea, one of the northernmost countries, Baltic countries, and yes, it's known for its very far-reaching secularization.
And so we'll be talking a lot about that in a moment, but the study of religion in Estonia, is that something relatively new, like religious studies at an academic institution?
Well, actually, no, but to answer this question, we have to look back a bit in history. So during Soviet Union, the only possibility to study religion was within the framework of scientific atheism, and another possibility was folkloristics, where folk beliefs were studied as a part of national heritage. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, scientific atheism, of course, faded away, and the study of religion was newly established under the label of theology, which is in Estonia as an umbrella term for both theology and the study of religion. And this, I would say, in the early days, it was more influenced by theological thinking, but in the last decade, it has more moved towards the study of religion. And the focus is on religious change, new religious movements, but mostly it's still about Christian churches and their relationship to the state.
And of course, we'll be hearing, I hope at the end of the interview, about a certain conference that's going to be happening in Estonia, hosted by the Estonian Association. So it's clearly been something that's developing there. You mentioned the Soviet times there, and I suppose anything that we're going to talk about in the rest of this interview will probably require a bit of historical contextualization there. So the stereotype we have is obviously Soviets, not a massive fan of religion. Suppression, end of Soviet time, maybe some sort of resurgence. But let's give me an actual picture.
Well, it's correct that the usual understanding of Soviet anti-religious policy is understood as something monolithic that was uniform from the start till the end. But actually, there were quite big changes in religious policy, and in some periods it was harsher, other times less harsh. And after the Second World War, during Stalin's reign, the question of religion was some sort of secondary, but it changed radically under Nikita Khrushchev, who initiated an anti-religious campaign that lasted from 1958 until 1964. And in Estonia, this policy had three main directions. The first one was so-called administration of the churches, which meant that different kind of legislative restrictions and direct control over the inner life of churches. The second one was atheist propaganda through newspapers and lectures. And the third one was development of Soviet secular rituals to substitute religious rituals. And I would say that this administration and secular rituals were most effective, and as a result they managed to create an interruption in religious tradition and to get rid of religion from public space. But this of course didn't mean that they managed to turn people into atheists, but and apart from the years of Khrushchev's anti-religious drive, atheist propaganda was actually not very visible, and atheism was one of so-called red subjects closely associated with the hated Soviet ideology, and also the level of atheist propaganda was quite low, and therefore it didn't appeal to people. And so the result was a widespread indifference both towards religion and atheism, like a sort of ideological vacuum, and which was filled with all kinds of things when Soviet Union finally collapsed. And this actually explains why Estonians, while considering themselves not religious, have plethora of different beliefs and practices and so on, which are usually understood in terms of alternative spiritualities.
Excellent. Thanks for that. This might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but just for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with the dates, could you maybe give us sort of key dates in the 20th century, perhaps, of in Estonian history?
In Estonian history, well, Estonia was at first occupied by Soviet forces in 1940, then again in 1944, then Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Khrushchev was pushed aside in 1964, and then finally Soviet Union collapsed in 1991.
Fantastic. I just wanted to make sure that we got that in there. I guess if our listeners have seen Death of Stalin, they might be familiar with Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you've already alluded there to the suppression of religion and how this maybe largely succeeded in the public space. But a lot of your work then has been focusing upon contemporary surveys and how effective this might have been in individual lives. So perhaps let's get specifically into your own research, and you might want to just tell us a little bit about your research journey, the kind of questions that you've been asking, and then what it can tell us about religion, indifference, non-religion, and then we'll get onto this sort of national identity element as well.
Well, long story short, I started out as a historian. My PhD thesis was on the institutions that were involved in Soviet anti-religious policy. It was mainly archival work, and by the time it was finished in 2011, then the research on non-religion was already booming, and then I got interested how this Soviet background influences contemporary Estonian society. And by that time, Estonians had already discovered this forgotten link between atheism and Estonian national identity. So for the past 5 years, I have tried to keep a track on what's happening in Estonian society in connection with religion and non-religiosity. And currently, I'm involved in several projects that touch these subjects one on or another way, and one of them is called Relocation of the Sacred Around the Baltic Sea, which is led by my good colleague from Sweden, David Thurfjell, and it deals with the relationship between secularization and nature spirituality. And another project, what you already mentioned, was this Understanding Unbelief. And in addition, we are together with colleagues from Czech Republic, we are compiling an edited volume with a preliminary title, Atheism and Free Thinking in Central and Eastern Europe, which focuses on 20th and 21st century. And it's a combination of historical and sociological approaches, and hopefully will be the first comprehensive overview of the developments of current state of secular traditions in that region.
Mm. Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode. Fantastic. So how about we dive right into it then? One of my favorite anecdotes from your presentation yesterday, and this might serve as a useful starter, was when the survey question, should the churches modernize, was being asked, and people who were religious, people who were non-religious were maybe ticking agree, slightly agree, don't have any opinion, vastly disagree, all over the place. And when you actually got to your qualitative work, the story was, well, should the churches modernize? Should they have electricity? Should they have Wi-Fi? Even the vocabulary of the questions was sort of indicating what you might describe as a sort of secularization of language.
Yes.
Maybe that's a way into the conversation.
Yeah, this religious gap or this era of indifference, so it's really interesting how it has influenced society. And one of my research interests is how the language my informants use. And I have identified some really interesting features. And one of them is that words or terms, religious terms, they have very negative connotations. One of the most loaded word is probably believer. That has association with mental abnormality or ignorance, and this is, of course, one of the successes of atheist propaganda. And I also have heard from my Russian colleagues when they interviewed people and asked, "Are you a believer?" And then the response was, "No, I'm normal." So, and another thing is what you mentioned, this religious illiteracy and also this secularization of language. So this religious illiteracy, since religion in Estonian society has had a really low visibility. So people are sort of don't recognize the appearances of it, and also are incapable to express one's thoughts about religion because of the lack of knowledge. And there is a really interesting story in Tartu. There is a church, Maria Church, that was turned into a gym during Soviet era, and the bell tower was demolished and so on, but it has still had this very specific features of sacral building, like large arc windows and so on. And I heard from my informants that when they were children during the Soviet period, that when this building was finally given back to congregation and turned into sacral building again, they were really surprised that when they learned that it was actually a church building. So we can call it a religious blindness or something like that. And secularization of language is the third interesting feature which I have found. It's actually not so much secularization; it's more like de-Christianization. When religious terms have run dry of their Christian context. This example of church is a sort of a textbook example when church is understood only as a building, not an organization or a group of people, so it can create a lot of confusion. So yeah, and I got interested in that because I had a hunch that non-religious people might not understand the questions in the service the way they were meant to. So, and to some extent it seems to be true. And also it seems to be true that many questions asked in the service just prompt the answers and have no relevance to people before and after that. So I'm a bit hesitant how meaningful this collected data is. And of course, it's always the problem, but it can be or can have much more serious results in the context where religious illiteracy is more widespread.
Absolutely. It might help if we get some percentages here. I know that you've had them in your presentation. You mightn't have them to hand. But so it is, on certain surveys, it's quite an extraordinarily high number of sort of, we might say atheists, you might say non-identifiers, depending what the survey is. But then on this national identity front, I noticed that much of there was a large population of Russian Orthodox in Estonia, and so maybe you could comment on the sort of connection between Estonian and atheism and Russian Orthodoxy as it plays out.
Yes, the point seems to be that Orthodoxy is much more stickier than Lutheranism, and the story with Estonians is that one of the things is Estonian national narrative, which is a construct from 19th century and tells a story about Estonians' everlasting fight for freedom. And there are two types of national narratives. One is Golden Past, another is Promised Land, and the Estonian one is this Golden Past type. But usually this Golden Past refers to the time where country was very powerful, great kings and so on. But in Estonian case, this Golden Past is located into pre-Christian times, and Christianity is sort of seen as responsible for its demise. And the other thing is this connection between Estonian nationality and atheism. And it's a really interesting story, but it has actually very little to do with believing or not believing in the existence of God. And rather, it started out as an ethnic conflict. So the background is that Estonians were Christianized in 13th century during the Nordic Crusades, and after that they were ruled by different other nations until the 20th century. And this 19th century Romanticism resulted in the rise of Estonian national consciousness. And by that time, Estonia was incorporated to Russian Empire, but Estonians were ruled by Baltic German upper class. So, and most of the clergy was also Germans, so the church was not perceived as Estonians, but more like German. Now, in 1905, there was a revolution in Russian Empire and in Estonia as well, but in Estonia it took sort of nationalist form, so it was a fight for national autonomy. And the revolution was soon crushed, and punitive squads started to do their work, and many people were executed. And then Estonians accused German pastors that they didn't protect their parish members and rather collaborated with troops. And as a result, many Estonians didn't go to church anymore, and in return, Baltic Germans accused Estonians of atheism. So, and during Soviet era, atheist propaganda, of course, made good use of both motives and then created a new story of Estonians as historically being very skeptical toward religion and or being a religiously lukewarm nation. So, and in 2005, when Eurobarometer survey was published, and that revealed that only 16% of Estonians believe in personal God, and all this information was happily put together, and Estonians started to understand themselves as the least religious or most atheistic country in the world, despite the fact that the survey covered only Europe. So. However, Estonians are actually not the only ones with this claim, and similar motives are present also in Czech Republic, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Netherlands. So the question which country will be the least religious or most atheistic is probably going to be a new Olympic Games discipline or something like that.
And I wonder what the prize will be.
God.
You also had a leaflet in your presentation that said, if you're an Estonian, you listed a few things and said you do not believe in God unless it's Eurovision.
Right, right.
Now, I've only really got one more question before we talk about that important conference, but presumably this isn't getting the whole picture. You were showing a lot of nuance yesterday in a lot of the beliefs and practices that these so-called non-believers, non-identifiers subscribe to. So maybe you could add a bit more nuance to this contemporary situation.
Well, I would say that when we are talking about non-believers or atheists, then it basically boils down. That means that we are taking their identity as primary indicator. When we are talking in this way, then of course the meaning of atheism in Estonian case is sort of different than in Western context. It doesn't mean the explicit denial of God or something like that. Rather, if it refers to just not being Christian. And since atheism is the only known secular tradition in Estonian context, it has a very, very wide meaning. So.
Excellent. Well, we are at about 25 minutes, which is a perfect time for me to just say that obviously we're recording at the EASR in Bern in Switzerland, but the 2019 EASR is in Tartu in Estonia. So perhaps you could maybe sell the conference a little bit, just in terms of why might people want to come, but also maybe you could give us a hint of the sort of the intellectual thrust of the conference.
The topic of the conference is religion, continuations, and disruptions. And, conferences are very much like birthday parties. when you like the people, then you go, and at the same time they are like sort of style parties, and the topic gives the debates this general direction. So and this topic was of course inspired by Eastern European recent history, which is actually a continuation of different disruptions, and this notion applies to religion as well, and religion and understanding of religion is constantly changing. So, and this is, we thought that it would give a good direction for our style party, and to become a fruitful basis for discussing whatever changes occur in regard to religion. But other than that, Tartu is just a very lovely town, and by the way, our restaurant street is just 50 meters from the conference venue, and for the conference party we have a place called Gunpowder Cellar, which is really an old gunpowder cellar that is turned into a restaurant and claims to be a pub with the highest ceiling in the world, which is around 11 meters.
Okay, so the highest ceiling in the world, the lowest religiosity.
Exactly, they go together hand in hand.
Fantastic. One final question. So this conference that we're at right now, the theme is multiple religious identities. So maybe just a sort of final thought from you on how the Estonian context and that conference theme of multiple religious identities maybe speak to each other or not.
Of course, they speak to each other. They are both religion related, but of course, these continuations of religious identities and all this overlapping and constant changing. So I would say our conference in Tartu will be a mental continuation of this topic here.
Excellent. Well, listeners, if you want to continue with that mental continuation, in about a year's time, we should have a number of podcasts from Tartu for you. But for now, thanks for that really expansive but also quite specific teaser for the situation in Estonia and for your own research. So do check out Atko's profile, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that interview, Chris. And Atko, I am still undecided whether I'm going to be in Estonia. I would like to visit Tartu a great deal, but I did get a chance to meet Atko at the ASR a couple of years back, and he is a really nice fella.
Yeah, and you're too kind. Atko also got in touch last week about getting us a recording studio at the University of Tartu, so I'm just mentioning it now, first of all, to thank him for that, and second of all, to hold him to that. Because that's a wonderful thing that has been set up at previous conferences and just makes everything so much easier for proper conference coverage. And
we are getting ready to record interviews at the ASR already. We're glad to be sending Sydney Castillo Gardinez over as our official kind of representative at the ASR, which is essentially a very generous offer of sponsorship that the ASR give us, and it'll be Sydney this year. So looking forward to interviews from Tartu, but also looking forward to interviews from Sydney, who's been too busy to contribute for a little while, but is back in the game.
Absolutely. Another returning interviewer to the RSP is Ross Downing. You heard from him, I guess, last term, speaking with Anya Warren. He has this time been speaking to Vivian Asimos on Slenderman and online mythology, and I'm sure also the fact of Vivian's competing podcast will come up in the interview as well. No, it's not competing at all, but she is
complementing.
Complementing, exactly. She has a podcast on the study of religion and its interaction with popular culture. So do come back next week for that interview, and
you know, we need to get in touch with Ross as well about doing some more for us next year. Next year's BASR, which we are already thinking about. And if you have not seen the announcement for the call for papers for the next conference in September this year. It is available on the BASR website, basr.ac.uk.
My heart literally skipped a beat in a negative way when you mentioned September this year. Just the time keeps moving on so fast.
It's a common feature of time, at least in this particular earthly incarnation in which we find our souls trapped.
Because it feels like it was just last week that we were in Belfast for the last BASR.
Indeed.
So, oh well, I will take that knowledge with me while I go back to the office and try and get on with some work.
Well, in the meantime, though, thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop. Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.